Well, we are continuing our sermon series this autumn on Women of the Book. And as you heard from Heather, we're looking at a wonderful, remarkable woman named Rebekah. So as we will do this Sunday, and then maybe a few other Sundays, we will interweave Scripture with a sermon, because there's multiple passages to be able to look at, and well, that's what we're going to do this Sunday. So I'm going to offer a prayer as we dive into the text and look at its applications for us. Gracious God, give us ears to hear and eyes to see and hearts that are open to receive and respond to your word, your message to us this day. Amen. So Rebekah is one of the most prominent women in terms of her active role and her control of events in the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. Her story is found in Genesis chapters 24 all the way through 27. I highly do recommend that you read those, and I highly recommend you sign up for our Bible study, the online Bible study, because that will provide an opportunity and encouragement to actually read the totality of these stories in their context. We'll do the best job we can with the time we have this morning. So remember last week we looked at the story of Sarah and Abraham. Sarah is considered the first matriarch, the first mother of the faith. Well, after the death of Sarah and before his own death, Abraham knows that he must find a wife for their son, Isaac. Remember, Sarah received this message that she would give birth to a son in her old age, and she laughed. Last week's message. If you didn't listen to that, it's available online, by the way. Isaac, the word means laughter. So they have this son now who's become a grown man. So Abraham, as part of his duty, needs to arrange and line up a marriage to continue the legacy, to continue God's covenant promises. So he's determined to find a wife for Isaac from his old home in Mesopotamia and from among his own family. So Abraham sends his most trusted servant and believes that God will lead this servant to a woman whose heart God has prepared to become his son's wife. Now, this is all in the Scripture. This is all in narrative. So the servant takes 10 camels full of gifts and supplies and sets out for the town where Abraham's brother Nahor lives. And when the servant arrives, he stops outside of the town at the well. And wells back then were a social gathering place, but they were also where engagements happened. So he stops at the well. It's evening, the time generally when the daughters of the townspeople would come to draw water. And the servant of Abraham begins to pray. And he's praying sort of this long prayer, asking for God's direction, asking for God's favor and blessing upon this assignment that Abraham has given to him. And then we read this, and we're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 24, beginning with verse 15. So if you'd like to follow along, you can find it on page 19, the first section of your red Bible. Genesis 24, verses 15 through 27. Before he had even finished speaking, there was Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, coming out with her water jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very fair to look upon, a virgin whom no man had known. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please let me sip a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw for your camels also, until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw, and she drew for all of his camels. The man gazed at her in silence. to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels, and said, "Tell me, whose daughter are you? Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." She added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder and a place to spend the night." The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness towards my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the way to the house of my master's kin." So after this encounter, Rebekah ran home and told her mother's household about these things. It's the first part of the story that we will look at. A fascinating first interaction. So Rebekah ran home to tell her family about what just happened. Now, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. And Laban then ran out to this man to the spring. So then you have this interaction of the servant from Abraham and Laban exchanging everything that just happened. The servant is going back and saying, "This was the mission my master sent me on." And they recap for a while. So Rebekah's brothers, Laban included, said, "This seems to be from the Lord." So we agree, because it was their sort of right as the brothers, we agreed to let Rebekah become Isaac's wife, as God has spoken. So at this news, the servant bows again and presents lavish gifts to the whole family, the whole household. They ate and drank together, and they spent the night. And then we pick up these verses, Genesis 24, beginning with verse 54, which is probably on page 20. "Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. When they rose in the morning, he said, 'Send me back to my master.' So Rebekah's brother and her mother said, 'Let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go.' But he said to them, 'Do not delay me. Since the Lord has made my journey successful, let me go that I may go to my master.' They said, 'We will call the young woman and ask her.' And they called Rebekah, and they said to her, 'Will you go with this man?' She said, 'I will.' So they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse, along with Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, 'May you, our sister, become thousands of myriads. May your offspring gain possession of the gates of their foes.' Then Rebekah and her maids rose up, mounted the camels, and followed the man. And the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Now Isaac had come from Beer Lahai-roi and was settled in the Negeb. Isaac went out in the evening to walk in the field, and looking up, he saw camels coming. And Rebekah looked up, and when she saw Isaac, she slipped quickly from the camel and said to the servant, 'Who is the man over there, walking in the field to meet us?' Well, the servant said, 'It is my master.' So she took her veil and covered herself. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife. And he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death." We're going to pick up more of the story in a little bit. So we come to the story of Rebekah. She's considered the second of the matriarchs in the ancestor stories of Genesis. And as is important with all of the matriarchs, it is really helpful for us to understand the common culture of the time. arranged marriages were very common and accepted and widely practiced. That was the way of it. There are still countries and customs and cultures today that practice arranged marriages. And in a time and culture where women had very little rights or advocacy or even influence, Rebekah lived and navigated the constraints of her time, and she took agency, even crossing some established cultural boundaries. In those days, marriage was transactional. It was really a business deal between men, and men had the only say and the final say. And yet, it is Rebekah who has the most control over what happens. And we read about her intelligence in this story, her strength, her generosity, her readiness to help. These are attributes that actually take center stage in this story that one would think would be mostly about Isaac. But the focal point is on this remarkable woman named Rebekah. When the servant asks Rebekah for a sip of water, she not only gives him a drink from her own jar, but then she offers to water all of his camels. Extreme kindness and generosity. She shows self-confidence and assurance in her answers when talking about her identity, where she's from, her family. She speaks boldly. She shows warmth and hospitality in inviting the servant to stay with the family. And then what's really remarkable, when the family hesitates whether she should go or not, or whether she should do this deal or not, they decide the matter by letting Rebekah be the one to make the decision. They ask her and give her agency. Will you go? Will you stay? The choice is yours. And so Rebekah displays decisiveness in her decision to leave her homeland, her family, all that she knew, and displays that same adventurous spirit that her relatives far away once displayed when they too left their homeland to go to a new and distant country. So she agrees to leave at once and begins the long cross-country adventure journey from Mesopotamia to Canaan, following, quite literally, probably the footsteps and the path that Abraham and Sarah took a generation before. Understanding the lineage and the stories, honoring those, and having that same adventurous spirit and that same courage to say, I'll go. I'm up for an adventure. Rebekah is unafraid to take action, even when it involves opening up a new chapter in life. May that be true for us as well. If we feel something coming upon us, a choice, a decision, an option, to maybe start something new, to maybe move somewhere, begin a new chapter in life, may we have the courage, like Rebekah, to bravely say yes to a new adventure, to a new season in our lives. Another really interesting part of this text is that the verb to go is used of Rebekah 7 times in this whole courtship narrative. She's not passive in this story at all. In fact, Isaac sort of plays a very passive role. He doesn't really do much, just shows up. Rebekah does everything. So her behavior just in this one chapter is depicted by these action verbs. She runs, she draws water, she fills jars, she rides a camel. Yes, I do understand that those were roles relegated to women, but within the context of her time. And that's important to know and for us to understand and appreciate. She wasn't passive at all. Now, I've said this before, if this story were to take place today, in certain cultures, it would be a very different story. But it was thousands and thousands of years ago and generations ago. And yet within the culture, it's amazing the agency and the action that Rebekah took. It is Rebekah who is more dynamic and proactive than anyone else in this story. But the story doesn't end there with the courtship and the marriage and honeymoon. Her story continues. So Rebekah goes to Isaac's house. They actually say the house of his mother, Sarah's house, and she becomes his wife. And they have trouble conceiving, like Sarah did. This is a narrative that we'll see with many of these women in these stories in the Old Testament. But eventually, Rebekah becomes pregnant with twins. Some of us know what that is like. Now, she has a very difficult pregnancy. This is all in the text. She's absolutely miserable. And perhaps some of you know what that is like as well. So Rebekah decides to ask of God. I mean, think about that. She's having a difficult pregnancy. It's not going well. She's miserable. And she sort of complains to God. We'll get into the specifics in just a moment. But she's the only matriarch to receive a direct message from God. She inquires of God. She asks of God, and the story says God answers her directly. And what's even more fascinating is the phrase that's used in the story, that Rebekah inquired of the Lord. That's the actual phrase, inquired of the Lord, is reserved in the Old Testament only for great prophets. Moses, Elisha, David, Saul, men, and Rebekah. The only other person that says she inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered her. So in other words, Rebekah was as close to God as any of the prophets in the Old Testament. That says something about this woman, Rebekah. So she says to God, why me? We've all been there, right? I'm sure we've all gone through something in our lives where we've wanted to raise our hands up and throw our prayers up and say, God, why me? But how many of us have actually done that? Or think, I should just understand my situation and not complain. Which isn't a bad, being content is important. But when we're really feeling these raw emotions, like Rebekah, why can't we inquire of the Lord, basically ask God, why? Why me? What's going on, God? And to not be afraid of that. To not think that God is going to be angry at us. God answered Rebekah. I believe those real and raw and honest prayers draw us even closer to God's heart. I really do. They're not formulaic. Those wonderful prayers are great as well, but the prayers that come from your heart. And sometimes in times of desperation. Like Rebekah, let's ask those prayers. Ask God the questions that we struggle with. I do believe this story tells us that God wants us to answer and to ask those questions. So God responds. Again, rather than being distant or angry or whatever fears we might have, God answers. and says these words of blessing, but words of sort of prophecy. It says, 2 nations are in your womb. So basically, it's like, you want to know why you're struggling, why this is a difficult pregnancy? You have 2 future nations in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. Those are pretty heavy words. But God gives Rebekah a sense of destiny, a sense of what she is doing is really important, not just for her and for her twins, but clearly God seems to indicate for future generations, maybe for the world. So the story continues. We read that Isaac and Rebekah are getting close to delivering and welcoming these children. So Genesis 25, verses 24 and 28. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah bore the sons. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. And then we read this in verses 28. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So then we come to this part of the story where we're reading about favoritism shown to children, especially twins. It reminds me one time my son Blake said, "Dad, do you have a favorite son?" And I said, "You know I do." And then I walked away. It's hard having children and twins, right? And there's emotions, raw emotions and feelings. What I love about the story is it doesn't hide those feelings. It says, yeah, they had favorites. Sure, Rebekah loved both, but she really loved Jacob. For different reasons, we know, we understand a little bit why, right? But not all of it. And then later on, which we won't have time to read the rest of this, Rebekah's always having these words of God in her mind about these 2 nations and how the older one, Esau, who came out first by 30 seconds, right, maybe, is going to actually end up serving the younger one. Now, what you have to know, too, again, culturally, that the older, whoever comes out first, if there's twins, but the older children would receive the main share of inheritance. The naming rights, the land, basically everything that the father would pass on would be given to the firstborn. Now, twins weren't as common then as they were now, but in this case, same thing would apply. If Esau was the firstborn, even by 30 seconds, Esau would get basically everything. It really wasn't fair. It's the way it was. But Rebekah had this in mind and in heart that somehow the story was going to end up differently, that the younger son, Jacob, the more, we could say, mild-mannered, temperate child, would end up being the one who God would choose to lead a nation. Jacob, not Esau. So Rebekah, later on in her years, used some cleverness and a little trickery to help her son, Jacob, deceive his dad in his dad's old age to steal the birthright. It's a little complicated. It's not a legal document like we have now. If Isaac offers a blessing, the blessings were binding, basically. And that's important to know because she used some trickery to make Jacob look and smell like Esau, brought Jacob to Isaac in his old age, sort of he's on his deathbed. He thinks it's the other son. He offers the blessing, which with the blessing comes the inheritance and everything. Right? These stories are interesting. They're real, they're raw, they're human. And I look at the story and think Rebekah was like us. She was a human, right? She had favorites. She wasn't perfect. I'm sure she wasn't the perfect parent. Probably Esau didn't think she was the perfect parent. However, given all of that, what we know and what we read is that she still maintained this personal and intimate relationship with God, which became the foundation of her actions and even her advocacy on behalf of her younger son. And then what we know from the scriptures is that actually, because of Rebekah's initiative, the covenant that God made with Abraham was passed down to Jacob, as it was meant to be, according to God's plans. So Rebekah's faith was as strong as the prophets. Her trust was not in herself, but her trust was in God. And she was so close to God that she understood God's covenants and the promises made with Abraham and Isaac, and she wanted to be a part of that. She made God's plans her own plans, and in some ways let go of what she wanted and put her energy towards achieving what God wanted. And she did so by taking initiative and agency to ensure the future of God's covenant with God's people. She committed her way to the Lord, as we read earlier from that psalm. She trusted in God, and she acted. Trust in the Lord and do good so that you will live in the land and enjoy security, as we heard earlier. And so we look at this story, understanding that we too are called to partner with God, to not remain on the sidelines, but to be part of something dynamic, to take action and advocacy and use our own agency in whatever context we find ourselves in. And sometimes we want and need those contexts and situations to change. They may not be right, but they are what they are for now. And rather than being passive, saying, I still can do something. I still have a voice. I still have a platform. It may not be what I hope it would be. It may not be what it will be. But I can do and say something. Rebekah shows us how to take initiative, rather than waiting for something to happen to us or to those we love. And so this second matriarch reminds us that God calls people of faith to make things happen, to be brave and to be strong and courageous, like Rebekah. Because God's plans do not just happen to us, they happen through us, to be a blessing to others and a force for good. Thanks be to God.